Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 50 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and tips and information that pilots like you can actually use. Today, we're going to answer a number of listener questions and also bring you listener feedback. Some of those questions include ADS-B and what to do if you lose the glide slope when flying an ILS. Plus, coming up in the news, a now former pilot in Oklahoma is facing serious jail time on terrorism charges, and we'll tell you what he's accused of doing. And a Florida man is accused of attempting to steal 2 aircraft, and he's captured after he crashes into a fuel truck. And Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University is offering a free online course that starts later in February, and we'll tell you what you can learn by taking that course. And finally, sheriff's deputies here in California succeeded in pulling over 2 pilots while they were flying, and we'll tell you how those pilots drew the attention of law enforcement. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot, and hopefully have a little fun. We're going to share part of my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of a couple of books, including the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year, and a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR-20 and 22. Now, last week in episode 49, we talked about radio communication at towered airports and changes in the rules for testing emergency locator transmitters, or ELTs. So if you missed that episode, you might want to check it out. Now get ready, because the news starts now. From aeronews.net, privatization is back in the news. The White House budget includes ATC privatization. The latest proposal, released on Monday, February 12th, includes a plan to privatize ATC in the U.S., a concept that's been opposed by most of the industry's major advocacy groups. In a statement released shortly after the budget was made public, NBAA President and CEO Ed Bolin restated the association's strong opposition to the proposal, calling it a giveaway to the big airlines. And if you missed our ATC special privatization episode we did last summer, we talked about how the government is proposing to give away $53 billion in assets that were paid for with taxpayer money. Not sell off the assets to the highest bidder, just give them away. So I agree with CEO Ed Bolin's statement that it's a giveaway to the airlines. He noted that legislation in the House of Representatives contains a similar proposal that's been met with objections by a large, diverse group of associations. He says privatization would especially hurt the general aviation industry, which supports more than 1 million jobs and generates $200 billion a year in economic activity. So, folks, this issue will probably never go away, and as pilots will probably have to continue to pose this for many years to come. From Reuters.com comes a story that a Saudi man in Oklahoma was charged with lying about training with Al-Qaeda. The Saudi man who attended flight school in Oklahoma was charged last week with visa fraud for allegedly having lied about attending an Al-Qaeda training camp in Afghanistan in 2000, according to the U.S. Justice Department. A grand jury returned a 3-count indictment against the man, who, after his fingerprints turned up on documents found by the U.S. military at an Al-Qaeda safe house in Afghanistan. Court documents show that this Weatherford, Oklahoma man was issued a private pilot certificate in November 2016, but it was revoked last year because federal authorities considered him at risk for air piracy or terrorism. Based on a criminal complaint signed in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Oklahoma and unsealed last week, he was taken into custody by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. According to the complaint, the FBI found 15 of his fingerprints on an application to a training camp located at one of the training sites in Afghanistan. He's alleged to have first entered the United States in late 2011 on a non-immigrant visa based on his wife's status as a foreign student. According to the complaint, he answered several questions on his visa application falsely, including whether he had ever supported terrorist organizations. He faces up to 10 years in prison on each of 2 charges of visa fraud and up to 8 years for lying about his involvement in international terrorism. And from avweb.com, the FAA has proposed a new AD that would affect over 14,000 Cessna aircraft, including Cessna 172s, 182s, 206, and 210 models. Apparently, cracks were found in the lower area of the forward cabin doorpost bulkhead. Now, that's where the wing strut attaches, and the AD requires repetitive inspections of the area. After one owner reported finding cracks, Additional inspections revealed that the cracks could be found in 50 additional aircraft. It's been determined that the cracks resulted from metal fatigue, according to the AD. Now, the cracks are in a somewhat tough-to-reach spot, and it takes about 90 minutes to do the inspection. The FAA is going along with Cessna's recommended interval for the inspections, and they don't start until the airframe reaches 4,000 hours. The initial inspection would have to be done within a year of that milestone, or after 200 hours, whichever comes first. After that, it's every 1,000 hours. If cracks are found, the repairs will cost about $3,000 and take a couple of days to do. Now, I've gone ahead and posted on our Patreon site the entire list of all models that are affected by this proposed AD. You can find that by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. In international news from avweb.com, Michael Goulian, Red Bull race pilot, has won his first event in 9 years. He's won the season opener in Abu Dhabi. Now, he was sponsored by Cirrus, and he ran the pylons in 53.695 seconds, a third of a second better than the 2017 overall champion Yoshi Moroya of Japan. Martin Sanka of the Czech Republic was third, and American Kirby Chambliss was fourth. According to Michael, it's been a long time coming to get to this second win, and my whole team is over the moon. He says, now we need consistency. There are 13 other great pilots in the Red Bull Air Race, and I feel nothing but excitement for the rest of the year. Should also mention that Canadian pilot Pete McLeod was third overall last year, but he finished last this year because he was disqualified for exceeding the 10G limit. Now, the next race will be in Cannes, France, on April 21st to 22nd. And as an aside, I should say I met Michael last month for the first time, and he talked then about all the modifications that the team had been making to the airplane during the past year to reduce weight. Now, as I recall, he said that every couple of pounds they shave off was equivalent to reducing the race time by about 1/100th of a second. So to give you one example of the lengths that they're going to reduce the weight, he said that they went through and they shortened each of the avionics wires so that they could reduce the weight by eliminating a little bit of wire a few inches at a time. Now, in total, he said they saved about 30 pounds, and perhaps that's how he got this first place win, because their weight reduction strategy is paying off. In other international news, this comes from an email I received from Piper Aircraft. They have received an order for 152 aircraft from Fanmei Aviation Technologies, who's their exclusive dealer in China. Now, this is the largest single trainer order ever received by Piper in their history. This 7-year purchase agreement is valued at $74 million. It includes 100 Archer single-engine trainers, 50 multi-engine Seminoles, 1 Seneca, and 1 Piper M350. Deliveries are beginning in March, with the first aircraft going to Fanmei's flight school in the Sichuan province. Now, to put this in perspective, for the most recent year for which Gamma has data, Piper sold $150 million worth of aircraft, so this is going to add about $10 million per year to their ongoing sales. And also in international news, this comes to us from the irishexaminer.com. 2 student pilots took off at the same time, and that can't be good. So this is a report that was just released on an incident that occurred last year, in which they say 2 light aircraft flown by student pilots took off at the same time from intersecting runways at the Cork airport. Aviation inspectors have described it as a serious incident. Now, the report from the Air Accident Investigation Unit says there was no risk of collision, but there could have been a more serious outcome if the timing of the takeoffs had been different. The incident occurred on May 23, 2017, when a 21-year-old student pilot from England on a solo flight in a Cessna 172 took off from the airport's second runway without clearance. He did so around the same time that another student pilot, accompanied by a flight instructor and in a different Cessna 172, was cleared to take off from the airport's main runway, and these 2 runways intersect at right angles. The report says the student pilot was on a solo flight and had received clearance to take up a taxiing position on the airport's second runway. So by that, I think they mean a line up and wait instruction, which would be to go onto the runway but then to stop. They say at the same time the other Cessna was cleared for takeoff when the student pilot informed the control tower he was ready for departure. An air traffic controller twice repeated, "Roger." The student pilot told investigators that he did not know if the use of the word "Roger" meant understood or go ahead. The air traffic controller expected the student pilot to hold his position as no takeoff clearance had been given. The report says the student's use of non-standard wording and seeking confirmation that he was ready for departure was the basis for a misunderstanding. It also said air traffic controller could have possibly avoided ambiguity by informing the student pilot to hold his position. Now, the event illustrates the necessity of clear communications between air traffic controllers and pilots. Quote, the use of standard radio telephony terminology and greater awareness on the part of the student by maintaining a good listening watch on the frequency could have prevented the situation from arising in the first place. The Cork Airport Management and the flight school have agreed to suspend the practice of solo student pilots using the second runway pending further review. And here's a story that's near and dear to my heart from generalaviationnews.com. The 2018 National GA Award honorees are named. Every year for the past 50 years, the GA Aviation Awards program and the FAA have recognized aviation professionals for their contributions in the fields of flight instruction, aviation, maintenance, avionics, and safety. And these are the winners of the 2017 National Awards. Daniel Peter Chrisman of Las Vegas is the 2018 Certificated Flight Instructor of the Year. William Pancake Jr. of Kaiser, West Virginia is the 2018 Aviation Technician of the Year. And Catherine Cavagnaro of Sewanee, Tennessee is the 2018 FAA Safety Team Representative of the Year. The FAA will present the awards in July during the EAA Air Venture in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and these people's names will be added to the plaque in the lobby at the EAA Air Venture Museum. Also in the prize package is an all-expense-paid trip to Oshkosh, both, by the way, for your spouse as well, to attend the awards presentation and other special GA award activities. And, of course, my wife and I were brought to Oshkosh almost 10 years ago when I became the 2008 National CFI of the Year. So this is a great honor, and I can tell you these people are going to have an awesome experience when they are at Oshkosh. Let's talk ever so briefly about the recipient of the CFI of the Year, Dan Chrisman. Dan soloed on his 16th birthday, and he received his private certificate a year later at age 17. His day job currently is as Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Force, where he's known as Taz, and he's currently the Deputy Commander of the Persistent Attack and Reconnaissance Operations Center at Creech Air Force Base, as well as a military instructor evaluator pilot. In addition to his Air Force duties, Dan averages 25 to 30 hours of flight instruction a month and another 10 to 15 hours of ground training per week. He's been an active flight instructor, either full-time or part-time, for 19 years. He's also a contributing instructor for a weekly free live streaming helicopter safety and education course available on YouTube at the HOGS, H-O-G-S website. Now, Bill Pancake, the 2018 Aviation Technician of the Year, also soloed on his 16th birthday, though back in 1956. Now, he worked for the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company as an electronics technician, but in 1973 decided to open his own restoration shop, Pancake Aviation. Word spread that Bill was in the airplane business, and what started out as a sideline grew into a successful business. Today, Bill spends much of his time helping aircraft owners and mechanics. Most days, he responds to 10 to 15 phone calls and dozens of emails from all over the world. And the 2018 National FAA Safety Team Rep of the Year, Catherine Cavagnaro, is a mathematician by training. She received her BS in mathematics at Santa Clara University, which is just right around the corner from me, and she got her PhD in math at the University of Illinois. She serves as a professor of mathematics and formerly as chair of the math department at the University of the South. In that capacity, she's developed and implemented courses in such areas as aerodynamics, differential equations, and mathematics modeling. Catherine also owns and operates the ACE Aerobatics School in Sewanee, Tennessee, where she's become widely known as an expert on spin training, recovery, and avoidance. She's an ATP pilot, and she also serves the Nashville FSDO as a designated pilot examiner. And congratulations to all three of these 2018 National GA Award winners. From our Stupid Criminals file, this comes from the newsherald.com. A Panama City beach man is facing several charges after he allegedly tried to steal not one, but two airplanes from a Tampa airport and then crashed a fuel truck into a hangar, according to police reports. Drew Bronnenberg, 28, was arrested after the failed aircraft heist. According to the Tampa Police Department, the incident started about 10:30 p.m. at night at the Peter O'Knight Airport. They reported that Bronnenberg first entered a hangar, pulled out a Piper PA-12 valued at about $60,000, and tried to start it. He failed to start that aircraft and then attempted to steal an Icon A5 valued at $285,000. Incidentally, there was a report about a week ago of an Icon A5 from Tampa, which had landed somewhere near Sanibel Island and was later taking on water. So it's possibly that was the same aircraft. Anyway, after both of his theft attempts were unsuccessful, he drove a golf cart to the airport's fuel pumps and started a fuel truck. Police reported he drove the truck back to one of the hangars and crashed it into the side of the building, causing about $250 in damage to the structure. He then left and was arrested minutes later. He's posted a combined bond of $26,000 on 11 charges, including burglary, grand theft, and criminal mischief. His occupation is listed as a lifeguard, and the FAA says that he does not have a pilot's license. Thank goodness for that. And from avweb.com comes a story that Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University is offering a free 2-week online class focusing on aircraft maintenance that will run from February 26th to March 11th. The course is open to the public and will be taught by Embry-Riddle faculty as well as experts from the aviation industry. They say our students will get a real-world look at the industry from multiple perspectives. They say they're not only focused on the maintenance technician, but also on those supervising and leading them. Coursework will be available for students to watch lectures and work on assignments on their own timetable, the university says, with lots of peer-to-peer interaction outside of the online classroom. Registration is open now. Also, by the way, Embry-Riddle offers a free online course called Introduction to Aviation with 9 lessons that cover the basics of aerodynamics, airspace, weather, and more. Students can enroll anytime and work at their own pace. And I'll look to see if I can find a link for this and post it in the show notes, as well as on our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And finally, in what has to be the ultimate low-speed chase in Southern California, 2 hot air balloons were pulled over by local sheriff's deputies here in California. The 2 hot air balloon pilots were forced to land their aircraft by San Bernardino County sheriff's deputies after they received 911 calls that the balloons were flying dangerously close to houses in the Yucaipa neighborhood. The Redlands Daily Fax reported that the 2 pilots were found to be hot air balloon enthusiasts and were flying their privately owned balloons for personal use. The 911 calls started to come in a little after 8 o'clock in the morning, and deputies arrived at the neighborhood where they spotted the balloons flying over the golf course, at times coming within 5 feet of rooftops and hitting trees. The deputies got the attention of the balloon pilots and asked them to land immediately. One came down in a school baseball field, the other in a nearby orange grove. The deputies interviewed the pilots and will forward the reports to the FAA for investigation. Officials have not found any indication that the balloons damaged any property and there were no injuries. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, lots of listener feedback and questions, including one listener who wants to know, after the January 2020 ADS-B mandate is in effect, will he finally be able to see all traffic using an ADS-B receiver, even if he doesn't have ADS-B out in his aircraft? Stick around. We'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Before we get to listener feedback and questions, let me give you a few quick updates. Now, by the time you hear this, I will be on my way in the back of a 737 flying to Knoxville, Tennessee, which is the home of the Cirrus Delivery Center. And I'll be picking up a brand new 2018 SR-22 and bringing it back to California for the owner who's not able to make it to Knoxville for this particular trip. I'm also going to bring along a pilot who has been out of flying for over 10 years, and he chose to get back into flying by getting checked out into an SR-20, which I just finished up with him at the Palo Alto airport. And now he's thinking about even buying a Cirrus, so give him a chance to see what that whole process is like. And I got some good news earlier this week. I'm excited to hear that AOPA has selected me to give the IFR training sessions at their regional fly-ins that will be held around the country this year. Now, the first one of those will be in Missoula, Montana, June 15th to the 16th. The other locations, which are going to be in September and October, are Santa Fe, New Mexico, Carbondale, Illinois, and Gulf Shores, Alabama. Now, interestingly, I have been to 3 of those cities, a couple of them multiple times, but the 4th one is in a state that I have never been to before. Now, I've been to 49 states, so after this year, I will have completed all 50 states, and I want to thank AOPA for helping me do a clean sweep of all the states. And I'll let you guess which one is my 50th state. But if you live anywhere near those 4 locations, consider flying in for the regional fly-in, and I would love to make your acquaintance. Now, a little excitement here earlier this evening. NBC Bay Area, our local NBC TV affiliate, was over here at the house just a couple hours ago. They were interviewing me for my comments on United Flight 1175, which had to shut down an engine earlier today while they were en route from San Francisco to Honolulu. Now, I found out about that story about 30 minutes before the aircraft landed when I got an alert through my Flight Radar 24 app on my phone, and that sends me an alert anytime an aircraft starts to squawk 7700, which is the emergency code. Now, the aircraft was a 7777, and from the video I've seen, it lost the front portion of the cowling from the right engine. Now, I don't know that that interview has been posted yet, but when it is available, I'll put it up on the Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome so you can see what it looked like when I was interviewed by NBC. And our survey is still up for aviation headsets. We're probably just going to leave that up another week or so and then read the results to you about that. But if you use an aviation headset and you'd like to tell us about your experiences with one, any issues you've encountered, or if you're thinking of buying a new one, tell us what aviation headset you're thinking of buying. Just go on out to the survey, aviationnewstalk.com/survey, and you can give us our feedback. But again, I'm going to just leave that up perhaps another week or so. And now this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about ways that you can help support this show. And I want to thank all the new Patreon sponsors that we've gotten over the last 3 weeks. Now, it turns out that some of these I would have known about when I had the last episode recorded, but my email notifications from Patreon stopped. So I contacted them and they have fixed that. So now I know about all these people who have been Patreon supporters, some for more than a couple of weeks now. So I want to thank Andrew Donahue, Ruben, Steve Honeycutt, Dean Marcutt, Paris Trivide, whose name I probably didn't quite say correctly, Biagio Mana, Gregory Hobbs, who I know, and Jarrett Davis. All of them have signed up to donate a few dollars a month here to the show. Now, you can make contributions of as little as $2 a month, and that cost will be billed to your credit card each month. And while you're on the Patreon site, you can check out the many general aviation stories which are posted there. For example, I mentioned earlier I have posted the video of the near mid-air collision with a skydiver. And there are different contribution levels, and you get different goodies. For example, at the $4 and above level, Patreons get access to my original scripts for each show. And at the $8 a month and above, donors can see the news stories that I've cut because I didn't have room for them in the show. And this week I had to cut over a dozen stories. So you can read those just by signing up at $8 a month or more. And as I've mentioned in the past, we don't take advertising on the show, but we do have expenses. So I certainly appreciate all the contributions that folks are willing to make. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. You can see the stories I've posted there, as well as consider making a contribution. Now, there's another way that you can help as well, because if you don't want to find yourself up there in the air wondering which buttons to push on your avionics, you can sign up for one of my online courses at pilotlearning.com. I've got courses there on the G1000 for both VFR and IFR operations, and we've got a GPS and WAAS course for those of you who are flying the latest fancy GPS approaches that use WAAS, such as LPV and LNAV plus V and so on. Now, the courses range in cost from $59 to $79, or you can take all of the courses for a low monthly membership of $29.95, and you can also sign up for the entire year for $299, which is the same as getting 2 free months. And if you sign up for the full year, you'll get a half-hour consulting call with me on any topic that you would like to discuss. And of course, the third way to support us is to leave a review. You can do that in the iTunes app, which is now called the Apple Podcast app, or you can download our dedicated app. Just go into the Apple App Store and search on Aviation News Talk. And I'm told that the new app for Android should be available very, very soon. I'll let you know as soon as that becomes available. Well, stick around. We'll be right back with listener feedback and questions on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Boy, I've got a huge backlog of feedback, so I thought I would spend part of this show doing a little bit more feedback and questions than we usually get to. So first one comes from Jim in Maryland. This came in, probably a couple of months ago. He said, I am looking at starting my training to get a private pilot license. I found your podcast. I'm listening to it. I am listening to Schuster's bill to privatize ATC. So I think he's probably talking about our privatization episode and talking about Representative Bill Schuster, who's a large proponent of ATC privatization. Jim. Jim says, I am from the county next door to Schuster's County, which, by the way, is southwestern Pennsylvania. It is a rural area. I agree with the concern of the GA community on the privatization of ATC. In doing a search on the background of the bill, I came across an article that Schuster admits a relationship with an airline lobbyist, Shelley Rubino, Vice President of Global Government Affairs for Airlines for America. This was admitted 2 years ago. There could also be a point that Schuster is ignorant of the impacts that will occur against the GA community. And yes, Jim, I've read many times in the past about Representative Schuster's relationship with a lobbyist for the organization that's pushing for ATC privatization. Yes, I think it's an obvious ethics violation, but ethics seems to be in short supply these days. I chose not to talk about it during the privatization episode because I wanted people to focus on the substance of the bill. And if I talked about the relationship that Schuster was having with the lobbyist, I was concerned that it might shift the conversation away from the bill. So I wrote back to Jim and I said, thanks for taking the time to email me. Also, please consider joining AOPA and or EAA, which are our primary lobby groups. We have strength in numbers, which will hopefully help in the fight against ATC privatization. And I have an email here from Grant McCarran from Australia. He says that no aviation medical is required for private flight, but that commercial pilots must have a grade 2 aviation medical. Additionally, we are all subject to CASA's drug and alcohol policy, which could include ramp tricks with breathalyzers and so on. Additionally, he says balloon pilots have to accumulate at least 75 hours PIC before they can commence their commercial training before their check ride, which has to be done with a CASA-designated balloon examiner. And he goes on a little bit more. He says you typically get well over 200 hours of PIC before you'd be flying 16-passenger balloons, and you're flying in a pretty controlled and audited environment. Can't say that all of this would have prevented the Texas crash, but it might have reduced the chances of it occurring. I'm not saying our way is perfect. It's way over the top with bureaucracy, but perhaps the U.S. commercial ballooning environment could take a few steps toward it. Thanks so much for sending that along, Grant. Of course, Grant was replying to a story that we had some time ago about a drunk pilot who had a balloon crash that resulted in the death of a number of his passengers down in Texas. And here's an email that comes from Michael in Virginia. He is responding to the interview that I did with Jason Blair in which we talked about the CFI shortage. He says, Max, I feel there is one piece of the CFI discussion that you missed in your podcast. I'm a DPE, that's a designated pilot examiner, and I'm also a military competency examiner. About 6 years ago, the FAA decided to allow military pilots who have been instructors to MILCOMP the CFI. Military instructor pilots take a written test and receive the CFI rating with a category and class appropriate to the aircraft in which he or she was authorized to instruct. So, for example, an Air Force T6 pilot can receive a CFII single-engine land, or a Navy P3 instructor pilot could receive a CFI multi-engine land rating. At first, DPEs were not authorized to issue these MILCOMP certificates, but about 3 years ago, the FAA decided to authorize DPEs to do MILCOMPs. He says, I've completed well over 100 of these CFI certificates for military instructor pilots in the past 3 years. Most of these military pilots are applying to the airlines and want the CFI for their resume. When I read about the total number of CFIs and the CFI shortage, I can't help but think that these numbers are exacerbated by this influx of military CFIs to the FAA's CFI number. While well-trained, most are unprepared to instruct in GA aircraft, having no experience with Part 61 or GA aircraft. The conspiracist in me thinks the FAA may have enabled the military CFI just to boost the CFI numbers, since the CFI MILCOMP appeared after the Colgan 3407 crash, which was back in January of 2009. Now, follow up, I asked him how long he'd been a DPE. He said he'd been a DPE for 5 years, but it wasn't until the summer of 2014 that he was authorized to do military competency evaluations. He says, I do think this skews the number of CFIs, especially active CFIs, and those with the skills and knowledge to effectively instruct in general aviation. So thanks very much, Michael, for your input on that. And here's an email from Mahesh, who, if I remember correctly, is in the New York City area. He says, hi, Max. Good to hear from you. I haven't gotten around to this week's episode yet. I normally listen to it when I go for a run, but the weather has been a little too cold and snowy for me to be able to run. The flying is going well. Thanks for asking. I just got my commercial multi-engine certificate, and I'm going to apply to the regionals and hopefully start my second career in commercial aviation. So I said to him, congratulations. How many total hours do you have? And will any of the regionals help you complete your ATC ATP if you sign on with him. And he replied that he has 1,625 hours with about 60 multi-engine hours and over 700 hours in his Cirrus SR-22. He says, I think at this point, all the regionals offer help in completing the ATP. Many of them have their own ATP-CTP course as part of their training curriculum. So thanks for your email, Mahesh, and good luck with your second career. And here's an email that comes from Lance in Gainesville, Florida. He says, thanks for all the work you do on the podcast. It has become one of my favorite ones, right up there with Jason Miller's The Finer Points. So hearing the two of you together on the latest episode was like my pilot podcaster dream team. I'm ready to share with you a link to the headlamp I fly with, which sounds like it has all the features your long-lost Costco lamp had. And he gives me a link to a Black Diamond Spot headlamp, Octane 1. He says this headlight has a red night vision light, 2 white LEDs with different intensity settings, and it runs on 3 AAA batteries. It's my favorite night flight accessory. He says, well, I have you on the line here. I should share with you that I've heeded the call to pursue my CFI training. I got my private ticket 25 years ago as an 18-year-old kid, and then, as happens for many people, stopped flying for a long time. I picked it up 4 years ago, got my instrument rating in 2016, and I'm scheduled for my commercial check ride in February. The next step will be CFI. I'm a college professor by training and trade and look forward to integrating what I've learned about teaching with my passion for flying. Thanks for the encouragement. And I wrote back to him, Lance, glad you enjoyed hearing Jason and me on the same show. Interestingly, my debut in podcasting came as a guest in 2006 on the Finer Points of Flying podcast when I was interviewed by Jason about my first book. And I said, thanks for the information on the light. I haven't seen one yet that is continuously variable like my old one was. But as I recall, most of the time I had my old light on the lowest setting, so I should probably give up on trying to find one that's continuously variable like that. And I also said, kudos on your work toward the CFI. No question there is need for more CFIs. Hope you have fun pursuing it. And then teaching in the air. Best regards, Max. And then P.S., go Gators. So given that Lance is a professor in Gainesville, I think we know where he is teaching, which would be the University of Florida. All right, let's go to a listener question.
Hello, Max. This is Trevor from DesertPilot.com. I just had a quick question for you. After the 2020 mandate is in effect and everyone supposedly is equipped with ADS-B, when I have a ADS-B receiver in my cockpit and say that I'm flying an aircraft that doesn't have ADS-B, so for example a 1946 Champ with no electrical system in it, and I just have my iPad with said flight planning solution on it and a ADS-B receiver like a Stratus or Stratix, is the hockey puck rule still going to be in effect, or will they start broadcasting ADS-B traffic to everyone? And also, does that hockey puck rule apply for only traffic, or is it for weather as well? So, for example, if I'm in an area where there's no one around, will I still receive ADS-B weather, but possibly not ADS-B traffic? Love the show. Would love to hear from you.
Trevor, thanks for recording your question and sending it in. Now, your first comment was that the ADS-B mandate was going to require ADS-B for all aircraft. And that would be only true for aircraft that are going to be above 10,000 feet or going to be in Class Charlie and Class Bravo or above those type airspaces. Other aircraft are not required to have ADS-B. But you then went on to talk about an aircraft you might be in that doesn't have ADS-B. So it sounds like you already knew that anyway. Well, and just for the benefit of other listeners, currently, if you have an ADS-B receiver and you're in an aircraft that does not have ADS-B out, you are only going to see traffic in what's described as a hockey puck that surrounds other aircraft that have ADS-B out in their aircraft. So you're kind of a parasite. You're looking at the traffic that's in the data being sent to them. And as you fly toward the edge of that hockey puck, you're going to get less and less traffic that's relevant to your aircraft as you fly further away from the aircraft to whom all this traffic is being sent that you're kind of pigging back off of. And as far as I know, the FAA has no plans to change this plan after the January 2020 ADS-B mandate goes into effect. So no, I don't think anything is going to be different. I think if you don't have ADS-B out, you will not see traffic for your particular aircraft, and no matter what kind of ADS-B and receiver that you might have. Now, I also don't think this is going to affect weather at all. Today, you don't have to have ADS-B out to get the FIS-B weather, and so I don't think there's going to be a problem. I think you'll continue to get FIS-B weather, that's FIS-B, regardless of whether you have ADS-B out in your aircraft.
Hey, Max. I have a question that has been bugging me because I can't find the FAA saying one way or the other. If the glide slope fails during an ILS approach, do you convert to a localizer? Question. The reason because it seems like in the AIM, it says that an ILS reverts to a localizer. And as long as your altimeter is still working and you can stop at the MDA, it seems like I would rather continue to the MDA. If I can then see my runway at the missed approach point or before, then I'll land. Instead of going back up into the clouds if it's actual IMC day, just to have to come back around again. And I've talked to towers where they said, yeah, we'd rather have you just land instead of send you back into bad weather. Whereas other people would say, well, you were cleared for the ILS, not the localizer. Although on that point, it doesn't seem like approach really cares. They'll say, cleared for the ILS. When I request the localizer, I'll say, I want to do localizer. They'll say clear for the ILS. Then I switch to tower. I tell them localizer, and they say, okay, localizer. But the tower seems to not really care that much either way. Also, as long as they know which approach you're doing. Anyhow, thanks so much.
And thank you, Mark R., for recording and sending in that question. I think there is one place actually that does give you the authorization to convert to a localizer. I found this in the Instrument Flying Handbook, the FAA publication. It says the landing minimums published on charts are based on full operation of all components and visual aids associated with the instrument approach chart being used. Higher minimums are required with inoperative components or visual aids. Now, in this case, the glide slope is going to be an inoperative component. They say, for example, if the ALS F-1 approach lighting system were inoperative, the visibility minimums for an ILS would need to be increased by 1/4 mile. If more than one component is inoperative, each minimum is raised to the highest minimum required by any single component that is inoperative. ILS glide slope inoperative minimums are published on instrument approach charts as localizer minimums. So what they're basically saying is, yes, if you have a component fail, you can go ahead and use your inoperative components table. And in this case, if the glide slope were to fail, that would be the localizer minimums. But I would like to point out that you can't always convert to a localizer approach if the glide slope fails. For example, if you had simultaneous parallel ILS approach operations, pilots really should review the notes to determine whether or not you could continue with a non-precision localizer procedure if your glide slope failed. For example, there's a restriction on some localizer procedures. They'll have a note something like localizer procedure NA during simultaneous operations. Likewise, for some RNAV GPS approaches, use of LNAV procedures are often restricted during simultaneous operations. But as a general aviation pilot, I'd say it'd be pretty rare to be flying simultaneous ILS approaches, because usually you find those at large airports like, San Francisco, Dallas, Fort Worth, Denver International. So that doesn't really apply to the case you're talking about. But what does apply is that there are some approaches at smaller airports, and I'll take, for example, Salinas, California. The ILS 31 into that airport does not have localizer minimums, but they do publish a separate localizer DME runway 31 approach, which uses the same localizer. So presumably if you had that chart out when you lost the glide slope, you could switch to use the non-precision minimums for that approach. Of course, as you point out, you technically wouldn't have been cleared for that approach, though in the real world, I don't really think ATC is going to care if you use the localizer DME minimums after you've been cleared for the ILS approach, even if they are separate charts. But Mark, I think there's another issue here as well that should be addressed. You ask, are we allowed to fly to localizer minimums when glide slope goes out? I think you also ought to be asking the question, should you do that? And here's what I'm thinking. If you lose a glide slope, that kind of indicates there's been a failure somewhere, possibly on the ground. I would say more likely in the aircraft. And here's my question for you. If your glide slope fails, how do you know that nothing else failed at the same time? And I would say that you want to be really careful betting your life on continuing an approach when you've had any kind of equipment failure. Of course, there is a rule that says you have to notify ATC immediately of any equipment failure that occurs when you are on an IFR flight plan. So certainly you should notify them that you've lost the glide slope. That would give them the opportunity to check and see if there's any other failure, perhaps with ground equipment that has occurred. But I think this is really situational dependent. You'd have to have a very very, very clear understanding or belief that it was just your glide slope receiver had failed and not something else. And in the instant, it might be a little hard to determine that. So I would have you think about whether or not you actually should continue the approach. You might find it to your benefit to just go around, spend more time evaluating exactly what the failure was, and then perhaps coming back in, maybe even using a different type of approach that doesn't use the same kind of equipment that you were using. And we are getting close to the end here, so I want to encourage you to stick around and listen to bloopers at the end of the show. But I also want to take a moment to thank both Mark and Trevor for recording their questions, because recorded questions kind of make it to the top of the stack. I've got a number of emailed questions, and those take a little bit longer to get to. But if you want to record a question, go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question, and you can record your question directly from your smartphone. And of course, if you do want to send an email, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact and type it in. I do hear from folks through Twitter and also Facebook, and I appreciate that. Though I must tell you, sometimes it's a little bit harder to find those when I go back to record a show. So if you've got something that you want to go into the show, definitely send it to me as an email, because that's a little easier for me to go back and find when it comes time to record a show. And I did want to ask if you have any friends that you think might benefit from listening to this show or even enjoy listening to it, please write their name down. And when you get a chance, go ahead and send them an email and a link to this show. If they're not familiar with podcasts, just send them out to the Apple App Store, and they can download our dedicated podcast app by typing in Aviation News Talk in the Apple App Store. Of course, we hope to have one for Android available in just a couple of weeks. And finally, if you think that someday you might be buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now, because I can help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're considering a new Cirrus, and also help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious, if you're thinking about buying a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. Also, if you're looking for Cirrus flight training, let me know. You can come here to my airport in Palo Alto, California, or anywhere in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I also will travel to you depending upon what it is you're looking to do. I specialize in the Cirrus, and I work with people around the country. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Dangerously close to houses in these, how do you pronounce that anyway? On their own timetable, the university says, with lots of peer-to-peer interaction outside of the online class.